Okay, all right. Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody to the panel on Empire, which I'm very pleased to be chairing. I'm Mirca Madianou, and I teach at Goldsmiths in the Department of Media, Communications and Cultural Studies. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers whom I will introduce in a minute. Each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, more or less, which should allow enough time for discussion. And I propose that we take all questions at the end, as we did in previous panels. You're very welcome to type your questions as we go through the different talks, or you can also ask your question at the end, so that will make it perhaps more interactive. But please remember, we're recording the session, so if you do speak, then you will also appear on the actual recording. So if you'd rather not appear, by all means, type your question. Empire obviously has come up in so many of the previous panels. I thought that was really interesting, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I'm going to introduce the speakers now. I'll introduce them all in the beginning, and then invite everyone in turn to take the floor. So our first speaker is going to be Richard Smith, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Media, Communications and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths, and the author of the book Jamaican Volunteers in the First World War, Race, Masculinity and the Development of National Consciousness. He has published widely on the role of the media in British Empire and historical approaches to colonial soldiery in modern empires. Kathy Davies is an associate lecturer and PhD researcher in history at Sheffield Hallam University. Her research looks at the Manchester Guardian newspaper and the politics of empire in the interwar period. And Alexander Zevin is the author of the book Liberalism at Large, The World According to the Economist, which was published by Verso in 2019, and which was described by the FT as a highly readable history of one of the world's most influential publications, and an important contribution to the history of political thought. He is a historian at the City University of New York. So I think we should, without further ado, give the floor to Richard, who is our first presenter. Richard will be sharing some slides, and I suggest that we all switch off our cameras so that we just put the spotlight on Richard for his talk over the next 15 minutes. So Richard, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Just going to upload my presentation. Take me a couple of secs just to go through. Here we go. Okay, so essentially I'm going to be talking, my talk's been broadly billed as Pan-Africanism and Anti-colonial Struggle. And really this is a key area of interest for me, starting really from the experiences of soldiers, particularly from the Caribbean during the First World War, but looking at their growing political consciousness in the wake of their wartime experiences, and how this fed into the Pan-African movements of the 20s and 30s, particularly in the Caribbean itself, but also in a really what we might call a Black Atlantic context. So looking at the experiences of Black radicals in the US, particularly in Harlem, and also the increasing importance of London as a centre of anti-colonial and Black radicalism in the period after the First World War. So that's kind of my starting position, as it were, and really my key area of interest. And what I thought would be quite an interesting kind of focus for today's paper was how the Guardian addressed the question of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, And as far as Pan-Africanists were concerned and anti-imperial activists were concerned, this was a huge question for activists to address, and particularly from the position of people who had volunteered for the British Empire in the First World War and then wished to defend the integrity of Ethiopia, which at that point was one of only 2 independent states within the continent of Africa. So in this sense, Ethiopia, as far as Pan-Africanists are concerned, was a kind of beacon, despite the fact that Ethiopia itself was an imperial power. Ethiopia had consolidated its empire during the latter stages of the 19th century, and in many ways had its own kind of internal contradictions. But nevertheless, Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Empire, was a kind of beacon for Pan-Africanists in very much a Black Atlantic tradition. And obviously, the other key issue for me in terms of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia is the fact that it really highlights the interwar period as an ongoing continuation of colonial and imperial conflict that hadn't really been resolved by the First World War itself. Of course, there were winners and losers as far as the European powers were concerned, but very much many of the key questions around imperialism and colonialism that had contributed to the First World War, the conflict of the First World War, remained largely unresolved. And this is particularly so in terms of Mussolini's ambition from the early 20s when he comes to power in Italy, in terms of his attempt to establish what we might term a new Roman Empire, an attempt to avenge the humiliating defeat of Italy in Abyssinia stroke Ethiopia in 1896 at the Battle of Adowa, which for a time put an end to Italian imperialist hopes in Africa. And obviously in the post-First World War period, Mussolini hopes to reinvigorate the idea of a new Roman Empire, and sets very quickly to start building attempting to build a new Roman Empire from his accession to power in 1923. Interestingly enough, he very quickly concludes a treaty with Ethiopia that's in 1928 that suggests that any disputes between the 2 countries should be resolved by some form of negotiation. But in the subsequent period, he continued to build up troops in the neighbouring territories of Italian Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. And one of the key things to remember, and this is particularly so in the context of the recent report of the lack of remembrance of the African contribution in the First World War itself, that Mussolini, despite his clear fascist agenda, relied very heavily on Eritrean and Somalian soldiers to pursue the subsequent conquest of Ethiopia from October 1935 onwards. But more importantly, Ethiopia and the Italian invasion becomes, aside from the importance in terms of Pan-Africanism, also focuses in many ways a number of key kind of issues really for people on the left and liberals in Europe itself. Ethiopia becomes a focus of humanitarianism, and I put here a photograph of John Melly, who led the Red Cross ambulance mission to Ethiopia during the war and was tragically killed when the Italian forces actually entered Addis Ababa in May 1936. So it becomes a focus of humanitarianism, internationalism, and anti-imperialism, and also, of course, anti-fascism. And alongside this, Ethiopia and the Italian invasion kind of launches in many ways, or provides journalistic opportunities for many key figures in British journalism during the 1930s. You know, Oberon Moore being the most obvious example, and his satirical novel Scoop, that's already been mentioned in the course of the conference. Bill Deeds of the Daily Telegraph, you know, establishes his career reporting on the war from Ethiopia. Other figures such as William Makin, who published a key account, Ladislav Farago, who also published accounts of the conflict and were notable journalists of the time. And the war itself, in many ways, becomes what we might call the most anticipated war. But one of the tragic things about it is that there was a relative rapid loss of interest once the conflict itself took place. My research in terms of The Guardian kind of really highlights this process. That I did a pretty extensive search of the online databases of The Guardian news from this period, from during 1935-36, and there's at least 200 pieces of writing of various kinds, you know, including editorial features, reports from correspondents, reports from global news agencies, and so forth, really highlighting the importance of the conflict. But and a very active correspondence on the pages on the letters pages of The Guardian, and you know, not least people such as Sylvia Pankhurst, who of course became a key figure in the pro-Ethiopian cause and entertained Selassie in London and elsewhere in the UK once he fled here in exile after the Italian victory in May 1936. And of course she founded a newspaper, the New Times and Ethiopian News, based around the very cause of Ethiopia and Ethiopian independence. But what I want to briefly, you know, what I want to focus on for the remainder of today's talk is really look at some of the editorial contents of The Guardian's paper, which tended, in fact, to be most focused in the period leading up to the actual outbreak of hostilities in October 1935. Look at some of the features and look at the work of two of the key correspondents with The Guardian, Geoffrey Garrett, who was the Addis Ababa correspondent in the early stages of the war, and Robert Dell, who was the correspondent for The Guardian at Geneva, where many of the debates around the conflict were actually taking place, and where many of the key decisions of the global powers were being made in relation to the fate of Ethiopia. So some really key kind of figures really here, Geoffrey Garrett and Robert Dell, although in many ways they've really disappeared from the forefront of our understanding of journalism during this time. They were nevertheless very key figures that I think are worthy of discussion. So to really briefly talk about some of the editorial content, and one of the interesting things about the editorial content in The Guardian, that the majority of it actually is composed or written prior to the actual outbreak of hostilities. There was an event in the border areas of between Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland in the latter part of 1934, known as the Walwal incident where there was an incursion by Italian forces, and in many ways this precipitated the subsequent conflict, because it became a focus of Italian claims for compensation. They totally refused to negotiate, as had been as was the understanding of the agreement between Italy and Ethiopia in 1928, and they also found many ways of evading any meaningful discussion at the League of Nations in Geneva, by constantly pressing claims that they should be compensated for the attack by Ethiopia on Italian soldiers who were essentially African Italian soldiers at the latter end of 1934. And what's really interesting about the Guardian correspondence is that it really highlights the uncompromising and bellicose position of Italy, and argues that Italy should actually withdraw to its own colonial territories of Eritrea and Somaliland, and in the process avoid provoking local clan leaders who, in many ways, the Ethiopian leader Haile Selassie himself had trouble keeping control of. And the Guardian at this point is really concerned with establishing a neutral zone. It's concerned with preserving the reputation of the League of Nations, and really is arguing that French and British attempts to resolve the conflict by direct negotiations, which in many ways were really giving Italy carte blanche to proceed with a full-scale invasion, that in the light of this, that the League itself must intervene and act to ensure a fair settlement. So really, the Guardian's pretty clear that Italy was engaged in acts of hostility. They were engaged in armed brinkmanship, but at the same time they were kind of, despite the war itself being characterized subsequently as the most predicted war of all time, there was still a sense on the pages of the Guardian that if Mussolini actually invaded, this would be a severe miscalculation. And the Guardian itself is constantly arguing that Italy should abide by the terms of the 1928 treaty, should negotiate a settlement, and that settlement itself should be arbitrated by the League. So, and at points, for example, in May 1935, the Guardian talks about the strange method of negotiating by mobilization. It talks openly in terms of a fascist dictatorship and in terms of Italian ambitions. I can see Mirca, are you wanting me to wrap up quickly?
It's 15 minutes, so if you can begin to wrap up. Really so
I think what I'd like to do for the last couple of minutes is just highlight two key figures for me, and the first figure is Geoffrey Garrett, who was the Guardian special correspondent in Ethiopia, in Addis, for the first part of the conflict from September 1935, and out of his experiences produces a study, Mussolini's Roman Empire. And Garrett himself is a very interesting figure. He started life working life as an Indian civil servant, but then resigned shortly after the First World War because of the failure of British agricultural policy in India, which of course had contributed to many famines and rural poverty. And he wrote widely on India. He was an associate of Edward John Thompson, the father of E.P. Thompson, and really, I think one of the key focal points of his study, Mussolini's Roman Empire, is his recognition of the power of the media of this time, the fact that the overwhelming majority of the British press either overlooked or the Italian aggression or dressed it up in rather supportive and admiring terms, and in that sense he provided a very critical and important voice, both on the pages of The Guardian and in his subsequent activism. He was a member of the Independent Labour Party, and he also joined the cause, the Republican cause in Spain following the Ethiopian conflict in 1936. So a very key and unknown or latterly unknown figure, but a key position, a key voice of the left, really, who was writing actively on the pages of The Guardian and produced some very interesting analysis in his own writings. And the other figure I briefly wanted to mention was Robert Dell, who, again, from his photograph, he looks the most unlikely radical figure. He was the first editor of the Burlington magazine, which is a fine arts magazine still running, but which started in 1903. He was the first editor of the Burlington. He was a Fabian socialist. He also was a Catholic convert, an antique dealer in Paris for a while, and a war correspondent in Paris during the First World War, but wrote extensively on the way that Britain essentially, during the League of Nations discussions around the future of Ethiopia, how they essentially colluded with Italian aggression. And his study, The Geneva Racket, which in many ways was a more detailed exploration of his reports for The Guardian, really highlighted something that Mark Curtis mentioned in his keynote address yesterday, this sense that of the malign influence of British foreign policy that the Guardian tends to overlook. I think one of the key things about Robert Dell in his work, and even in his reporting for The Guardian, that he actually highlighted how British obfuscation, how British collusion with Italy in pursuit of its own imperial and European interests had betrayed the Ethiopian cause, and had essentially, really, as early as the mid-1920s, really given Mussolini a red light to pursue Italian colonial and imperial interests in Ethiopia. And so I'll close on that point now, and apologies for slightly overrunning, but look forward to a lively discussion following the other two presentations.
Thank you so much, Richard. And sorry, I had to wave and come on screen. So we move to our second speaker, Kathy Davies, who is going to talk about the Irish War of Independence. You have slides, Kathy, right? Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you. I think you're muted.
After a year of online teaching, you would have thought I'd learned that by now, but never mind. Right, can we see what I'm looking at? Okay. Can everyone see my slides okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the Irish question has
Kathy,
been...
sorry, you might want to slide share. We might have a better view of the slides if you you do the slideshow rather. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. This is what we practiced
okay.
before this, and that was fine. So I don't know what you want me to do now.
Oh, sorry. I meant, if you click on the slideshow, we see the whole screen rather than just an overview. So it was fine before. You just had to on the top of your screen. But you don't mind. I don't mind. You can keep it like this if that's easier.
Is that not working? I can see it as fully in presentation mode. So
Okay, that's fine.
okay, right. I'll just crack on. So the Irish question is recognised as pivotal to the history of the Manchester Guardian as the archetype of the English liberal press. And Anglo-Irish politics and conflict was one of the most extensively covered political issues by the Manchester Guardian during the 57-year editorship of C.P. Scott. And it was the single issue editorialised most by Scott personally. This paper addresses the Manchester Guardian's editorial line on Anglo-Irish politics during the apex of Ireland's revolution, the War of Independence. This began with the establishment of the Republican Parliament, Dáil in Dublin in January 1919. The conflict concluded with the Anglo-Irish Truce in July 1921. Editor C.P. Scott personally contributed 118 leading articles on Ireland over this period, and 1919 to 1922 was Scott's most active leader writing years because of the conflict and subsequent peace negotiations. Throughout the first year of the Irish War of Independence, Scott's editorial commentary focused on Ireland's right to self-determination. This concept of self-determination, promoted by President Woodrow Wilson at the close of the First World War, gained global prominence, especially during the initial months of the Paris Peace Conference, which also began in January 1919. The Guardian supported and promoted some level of political self-determination for Ireland on the grounds that the Irish had a distinct national identity. Scott maintained, Ireland is not England and never will be as such. She is a distinct national unit demanding recognition as such. By recognising that the national identity of the Irish was different to that of the English, that Ireland was a separate nationality, the Guardian argued that the Irish had a right to govern themselves. Even in recognition of internal divisions in Ireland, Scott insisted, an Ulster Protestant is just as much an Irishman and just as little a mere Englishman as a Catholic nationalist. He is a different sort of Irishman, but Irish he is in his whole history and his whole outlook, and his material interests are indissolubly bound with those of the rest of Ireland. This notion of shared Irishness was also fundamental to the Guardian's strong critique of the partition of Ireland, as the Guardian maintained that the Irish population in its entirety was inextricably mixed. Nevertheless, the Guardian rejected claims by Irish Republicans for full independence of a united Ireland. Scott maintained that the principle of self-determination could not be used as a buzzword by the Republican Party, Sinn Féin, to justify an Irish republic. The Guardian argued that this concept, which signified self-government for nationally conscious peoples, could not be applied in the Irish case due to a conflict of rights and national aspirations between Irishmen and Irishmen. Scott insisted a shared Irishness and a distinct national identity that transcended internal differences in religion and politics to support some level of Irish self-determination and to object to proposals of partition. But the editor also used internal divisions between nationalists and unionists, Protestants and Catholics, to dismiss Republican claims to outright independence. In Scott's view, with partition impossible, the issue of a religiously and politically divided yet interwoven population presented an unavoidable barrier to full independence of a united Ireland. This chimed with the view that British imperial rule was necessary to temper internal struggles of colonised peoples. Although it must be pointed out that Scott had previously argued that the British were largely at fault for division in Ireland and that it was Britain who continued to exacerbate this division. Scott argued that while nationalist Ireland has had her rights for too long neglected, she must not forget the rights of others being Protestants and Unionists who resided predominantly in the province of Ulster. Scott also argued against a united Irish Republic, as he believed this would put British security and commercial interests at risk. The Guardian argued in favour of Irish political self-determination for Ireland and against partition, but objected to the establishment of a fully independent and united Irish Republic. Hence, C.P. Scott insisted that Dominion status for a united Ireland was the best solution to the generations-old Irish question. Scott explained that Dominion status would grant political self-determination with full responsibility for fiscal and domestic concerns, whilst avoiding a partition of the interwoven yet ideologically divided Irish population. Dominion status for a united Ireland would also ensure that the Protestant minority were protected and that the security and trade interests of Britain remained secure. This approach, in Scott's view, would also satisfy Unionists, as Ireland would remain within the British Empire. The Guardian maintained that Ireland's foreign policy and armed forces should remain under the authority of Britain, but political liberty should be given in all other areas, with the caveat that the protection of the religious freedom and religious education for Protestants would be guaranteed. For the Guardian, this approach would allow Ireland to be as free as it is possible for her to be, consistently with maintaining the unity of the realm. Scott acknowledged that the majority of nationalist Ireland supported complete independence, not Dominion status. This was demonstrated by the overwhelming victory of Sinn Féin and the decimation of the moderate Irish Parliamentary Party in the 1918 general election. Still, the editor argued that opinion in Ireland was not static and that Dominion status, if offered, might encourage a shift to a more moderate outlook. The Guardian continued to promote Dominion status for a united Ireland as the most suitable form of political self-determination for the Irish throughout the war and during the subsequent peace negotiations. From December 1919, Scott's commentary focused on the Fourth Home Rule Bill, which proposed to partition Ireland into North and South, each with its own parliament within the United Kingdom. For the Guardian, the bill signified permanent division and a violent future for Ireland. Scott insisted that partition was not an approach that could secure long-term peace. Still, the bill came into law as the Government of Ireland Act in December 1920 and was implemented on 3rd of May 1921. The centenary of Irish partition is just over a week away. In the final months of 1920, however, despite the impending Government of Ireland Act, it was the ongoing violence in Ireland that was the most prominent theme in C.P. Scott's editorials. The Irish War for Independence became increasingly synonymous with violence on both sides from late 1919, but reprisals committed by the British recruits in Ireland notably escalated from September 1920 to early 1921. Reprisals were acts of violence against the Irish people, which included burning, property, and murder. They were said to be retaliations against the actions of the IRA. The term reprisal was used by The Guardian to describe British violence in Ireland from April 1920. But popular usage of the term did not begin until autumn 1920, when reprisals intensified. High-profile cases, such as the sack of Balbriggan, the Croke Park massacre, and the burning of Cork, all occurred during this period and gained the attention of the British press. Scott was staunchly against British reprisals in Ireland for two reasons. The first being that usually it was only Irish civilians affected, rather than IRA members who may or may not have committed attacks against the British. The second was that these acts of violence were, in Scott's words, utterly subversive of discipline and convert an armed force into a body of freebooters. Scott found the lack of discipline among the British forces abhorrent. Scott demonstrated an aversion to violence generally, but it was the affront to law and order that led Scott's objections. When official reprisals were sanctioned by the British government from December 1920, Scott argued that this was better than unofficial violence. Scott also recognised that these reprisals were not one-off incidents. They were part of an intensifying campaign of violence against the Irish. He maintained, a regular vendetta has been established with ever-increasing violence and accumulating wrongs. Despite this criticism of the Crown forces, however, the Guardian ultimately held the British government responsible for the violence. Scott maintained that the escalation of violence in late 1920 was a result of the repressive government policy epitomised by the passing of the Restoration of Ireland Act in August 1920. The Act granted similar powers seen under martial law. Scott described it as the most extreme and unconstitutional coercion act ever invented for the castigation of Ireland. Scott argued, Every end of orderly government and every hope of appeasement is defeated, and all the time the government can find nothing better to do than pour oil on the flames. Our rulers can find no better means of escape than the application of more and more force, while redress retires yet further into the background. The Guardian accused the government of exacerbating violence in Ireland and diminishing opportunity for conciliation. Hence, Scott believed it was the government's duty to intervene. But he also questions its ability to do so, suggesting it had lost control of its own forces. Scott's descriptions of the actions of British forces in Ireland's anarchy and mutiny reinforce this notion. The Guardian argued that a government that cannot control its armed forces is not a government at all. They are a public danger. Scott's criticism of the government and the Crown forces became increasingly emotive as the campaign of reprisals progressed. Following the sack of Balbriggan, Scott described how the British forces had committed deliberate and cold-blooded murders and given up nearly a whole town to the flames. The use of the word murder in Scott's commentary was important, as up until this point, the term had predominantly been reserved for the actions of the IRA. The more euphemistic term, reprisals, was still used frequently to describe this violence, but numerous examples demonstrate a development in Scott's discourse towards the end of that year. Scott termed the actions of the British as paying murder with murder. He described the system in Ireland as one where murder is requited with murder, arson on a great scale, and plunder go hand in hand with murder. Scott charged Prime Minister Lloyd George with knowing that real murder by the forces of the government had been committed. Scott now overtly described the actions of British forces as criminal, while placing accountability for this criminality on the British government. In comparison, discussions of the activities of the IRA were limited. Scott rarely devoted entire columns to Irish nationalist violence. British violence received more coverage because, for Scott, the actions of the Black and Tans and auxiliaries were an affront to the conception of law and government. So before I conclude, I'd now like to briefly highlight some of the influences on Scott's editorial commentary on the War of Independence. So, of course, the Guardian's liberal tradition under Scott and historical sympathy for modern Irish nationalism was at the foundation of Scott's commentary during the War of Independence. Scott's views shifted slightly over the course of the First World War, recognising in his editorials in late 1918 that now Home Rule did not go far enough. But he maintained a liberal constitutionalist stance on the Irish question and considered this question solved by the ratification of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in early 1922. The role of Guardian journalists should also be acknowledged. They informed Scott and the Guardian's readers' knowledge of developments in the war itself, as well as the political developments in Westminster. When Guardian journalist George Leach died while working in Ireland in 1919, a letter published in The Guardian noted, "How many Liberals whose opinions of the events in Ireland during the past 10 years have grown out of the information communicated to the Manchester Guardian by its special correspondent in Dublin and Belfast." Press censorship and propaganda. While formal censorship did not directly affect Guardian reporters, censorship of the Irish press disrupted sources of news utilised by The Guardian in Ireland. Violence and intimidation of journalists by Black and Tans and auxiliaries, or unofficial censorship, also occurred. Moreover, Sinn Féin and the British government propaganda policies influenced the broader press dialogue in which The Guardian participated. Republican propaganda efforts offered a source of news for The Guardian and the Scott's editorials. British propaganda, whilst having much less impact as a source of news, created a climate of misinformation in which The Guardian reporters worked. The Guardian exposed government propaganda as untruthful on a number of occasions. C.P. Scott's personal and political networks also played a significant role in the production of Scott's editorial content. British politicians, including Prime Minister Lloyd George, moderate Irish nationalists, including former leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, John Dillon, Manchester businessmen, academics, intellectuals, and friends, including the prominent Liberal L.T. Hobhouse, all informed, or at the very least reaffirmed, C.P. Scott's knowledge and opinions on Ireland during the war. These connections can be traced in Scott's private and editorial correspondence. Scott's connections frequently made suggestions or requests regarding content, and many had articles and letters to the editor published. Published letters to the editor also shaped editorial content, as Scott occasionally wrote leading articles directly addressing these letters regarding Ireland. These obviously fed into Scott's ideas of Ireland as well. The source locations of letters to the editor regarding Ireland over the course of the conflict and the subsequent peace negotiations are visualised here. Unfortunately, not as big as I would have liked. So just to conclude then, the Manchester Guardian's editorial stance during the Irish War of Independence, as demonstrated in Scott's commentary, maintained that although Ireland had a right to some form of political self-determination, complete independence from Britain and the Empire was not possible or justifiable by the principle of self-determination itself. The Guardian was against partition in Ireland in the face of internal divisions, but also argued that these ideological differences were a barrier to complete independence. Thus, C.P. Scott argued for Dominion status for a united Ireland throughout the conflict. As violence in Ireland intensified, Scott's editorial commentary turned to focus almost solely on violence committed by the Crown forces in late 1920. The Guardian strongly condemned this violence and attributed it to the British government's Irish policy. The Guardian was highly critical of the British government's Irish policy and supported moderate Irish nationalists. This stance challenged the mechanics of British rule in Ireland. The Guardian's proposed resolution to the Irish question, Dominion status, ensured that Ireland remained within the British Empire. This is an approach that was eventually adopted by the British government for Southern Ireland following the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. By supporting Dominion rule and opposing an Irish Republic, the Guardian curbed its confrontation to the overarching structures of British imperial authority. The Guardian's solution to the Irish question was an imperial one that promoted the British Empire. This endorsement of empire was also reflected in the newspaper's dramatically changed stance towards the British government following the Anglo-Irish Treaty in July 1921, and recognition of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in an imperial context from its signing in December 1921. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Very rich paper. I'm hearing some echo, but I hope that will be better now. And we move over to our third speaker, Alexander Zevin, who will talk on liberalism and empire. So Alexander, the floor is yours. You have about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Great. I'm really glad to be here. And in a way, these papers have gone in nice backwards order. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the First World War and what it reveals about dominant and subdominant strands of liberalism and radicalism within liberalism in the run-up to the First World War via a comparison of C.P. Scott and Francis Wrigley Hearst, the editor of The Economist. So I will get started. If I speak a bit fast, it's not a glitch. It's because I wrote too much and may leave some things out, but hopefully we can talk about them in our discussion. So, a strange thing happened on the way to the First World War. As Britain joined the conflict on August 4th, 1914, many of the liberals who had pledged to halt a rush to war a few weeks earlier, indeed many who had criticized, quote, aggressive imperialism ever since the Second Boer War in the press, parliament, and from 1906 inside the cabinet, suddenly fell silent. On the 23rd of July, during the July crisis of 1914, Lord William Hart, the close secretary, 11 out of 19 members opposed to British entry. Quote, a peace party, which if necessary shall break up the cabinet in the interests of abstention. In the event, just two resigned, uttering no public protest as they went. Harcourt, the architect of the scheme of resignations, was not even among them. On the 5th of August, he was instead drafting plans to seize German East and Southwest Africa, Togoland, the Cameroons, New Guinea, Nauru, and Samoa. Quote, German colonies, I shall take most of them, he informed his colleagues in the cabinet. The swift collapse of opposition to the war stunned radicals inside the Liberal Party. not just backbenchers in the Liberal Foreign Affairs Group who looked in vain for a signal in the Commons from dissenting ministers in the cabinet, but also writers, professors, journalists, and editors confident of their influence within the party. For one historian, what stunned them was the realization of their own weakness after 8 years of Liberal rule. Radical efforts from 1906 to 1914 to reduce armaments and restrain Liberal imperialists like Haldane at the War Office and Grey at the Foreign Office from tying Britain to France and Russia in the event of war had been so much, quote, whistling in the dark. Radical voices in the liberal press were loud, but this was belied not only by the huge imbalance between the liberal papers and the right-wing press, it also masked how little purchase the liberal press seemed to have on the liberal government itself. Asquith disliked C.P. Scott personally and called his and other radical journals reptile journals, and their editors are extreme peace lovers who took the, quote, Manchester Guardian tack. Radicals may have been whistling in the dark, but that whistling also reveals a lot about the relationship of liberalism to empire before and during the First World War, especially if we enlarge the frame beyond the traditional narrow focus of so much scholarship on party politics to encompass the more vibrant of the period. Doing so, I think, calls into question the strangely persistent idea that the fall of the last liberal government in 1915 to 1916 was either an event or was itself some kind of bolt from the blue. I want to challenge this notion by comparing two of the most important liberal publications, The Guardian and The Economist, via their editors, C.P. Scott and F.W. Hearst. Questions of empire and imperialism were central to Scott and to Hearst and profoundly affected their visions of liberalism and the direction they gave their papers. So I'll begin by comparing them and sort of talk about how empire was important to the conversion that they experienced towards a more progressive left-wing form of liberalism in the 1880s and 1890s. And then I'm going to flash forward to the First World War and talk about the fractures that emerged in their view of liberalism as a result of Britain's entry into the war. So the case for comparing Hearst and Scott. Both Scott and Hearst ran to be MPs. Scott more successfully after 3 tries in northeast Manchester. He won a seat in the Lee division of Lancashire in the late 1890s and kept it in the Khaki election of 1900. Both played an active role in the party as pressure points and conduits between government ministers, the press, and their respective constituencies. For Scott, as Des Friedman has shown, this was Manchester, the world of industry, of cotton, of mines, and other sections of the business community there. For Hearst, it was the City of London. Hearst even trained Scott's successor, his youngest son, E.T. Scott, who started his career under Hearst at The Economist. But above all, I think the comparison relies on the fact that Scott and Hearst both underwent conversions from a more traditional laissez-faire view of liberalism to more advanced versions or progressive versions of liberalism, and played central roles in shifting the papers they edited to the left of liberalism. Crucially, also, it's empire that I argue plays the key role in that shift. For Scott, a generation older than Hearst, the conversion took place at the time of the liberal fracture, liberal split over Irish Home Rule in 1886. In that split, the Guardian sided with Gladstone and against the breakaway liberal unionists in favor of devolving some power to a parliament in Dublin. At the time Scott became editor of The Guardian in 1872, things looked very different to him. He could still describe the local Reform Club in Manchester as, quote, very much in the hands of the extreme radical party, the Examiner Party, in fact, for the rival publication in Manchester. His positions at the time were skeptical of electoral reform, skeptical of women's suffrage, and of disestablishment, and firm on coercion in Ireland. These were in line with the Whiggish orientation of the paper he was taking over. But by the turn of the 1890s, after the Home Rule split, Scott and his writers, in particular W.T. Arnold and L.T. Hobhouse, were giving relatively sympathetic coverage to the claims of labor in the London dock strike of 1889, the mining strike of 1893, and the engineering strike of 1897. If labor and social reform played a more prominent role at the paper in the 1890s, So too, on the foreign front, the position of the paper was changed. Perhaps it represented best by the fact that the Guardian ran reports throughout 1901 from Emily Hobhouse on conditions in the so-called refugee camps in the Transvaal and in southern Africa during the Boer War, causing an uproar when her report for the South African Distress Fund was published in June of 1901. For Hirst, it was precisely the war in South Africa and the rise of a spirited pro-Boer opposition to it that led him to reevaluate his narrow commitment to free trade and to the principles of, quote, Bright, Cobden, Mill, and Gladstone, which he had restated as recently as 1897 in a polemic against, quote, collectivist fads within the Liberal Party. Now, during the Boer War, Hirst joined the League of Liberals Against Aggression and Militarism and worked with figures such as J.A. Hobson and H.W. Massingham. He also took over the Speaker, a weekly he turned with his friend J.L. Hand, from manufacturer Sir John Brunner, in a pro-Boer direction. Inviting Hobhouse to write for it, Hirst remarked that since leaving Oxford on, quote, foreign and home politics, both of us have moved, but he, I think, the most. Given the gravity of the Boer War crisis, liberal Cobdenites like Hirst and collectivists like Hobhouse had to come together to combat their shared enemies, liberal imperialists within the Liberal Party and tariff reforming unionists outside it. Hirst now endorsed, quote, radical change to fight imperialism and the plutocratic wealth that was fueling it. That meant, among other things, campaign finance reform, a permanent graduated income tax, and press reform, control of journals by their employees. And this brings us to The Economist. In contrast to The Guardian, it had swung to liberal unionism in the split over Home Rule in 1886. Primed by his experiences of the anti-war movement in 1899 to 1902, Hirst was about to swing it back into the liberal camp just at the moment of the liberal landslide in 1906. So the Economist was prepared, along with The Guardian, to play a prominent role in the rise of the new liberal government that took power in 1906. From 1906 to 1914, Scott and Hirst represented a more or less united front, not just against the twin threats of militarism and protectionism, represented by the Unionists under Chamberlain or Balfour, but also, and a fortiori, against the liberal imperialists in the cabinet and throughout the parliamentary party and the constituencies. Their diaries, letters, and public engagements reveal very similar, often coordinated attempts to exert pressure on individual ministers or to tip the balance in cabinet, both in articles and in private, at key moments in these years. During the naval panic of 1909 and other skirmishes with so-called big Navy liberals, during the Agadir crisis, the Second Moroccan crisis in 1911, over secret military talks initiated by Grey with France in 1912, and as members of the Liberal Federation and National Liberal Club, pushing for some sort of understanding with Germany and promoting positive stories about Germany in the British press. Nonetheless, in July-August 1914, Scott and Hirst splintered over how far they were willing to commit their papers to an anti-war or even a critical position once the fight for neutrality was lost after the 4th of August. By looking at some of their public statements, I think we get a sense of some of the blind spots and illusions that these radical liberals had about the relationship between liberalism and empire once war broke out. In July, The Guardian argued for a conference tasked with mediating the crisis in the Balkans. In response to the incendiary call by the Times for British intervention on behalf of France, The Guardian decried an organized, quote, organized conspiracy to drag us into the war should the attempts of the peacemakers fail. And it rejected that, quote, national honor or supposed treaty obligations to Belgium were grounds for war. The Daily News, The Nation, and at first the Westminster Gazette, along with The Economist, took similar lines. As the crisis escalated, Scott asked to meet Lloyd George on 27 July. Quote, this is what Lloyd George said to him, As to the European situation, there can be no question of our taking part in any war in the first instance. He knew of no minister who would be in favor of it, and he did not believe the Times article represented the views even of the Foreign Office. Scott relayed in another letter to the chief whip the long-standing position of the Guardian on this. Quote, to make it plain from the first that if Russia and France went to war, we should not be in it. I hope Grey would keep them out of this war, but if he let us into it, there would be an end of the existing liberal combination, and the next advance would have to be based on radicalism and labor. A week later, on the 3rd of August, Scott wired Lloyd George an emotional plea and a warning, quote, feeling of intense exasperation among leading liberals here at prospect of government embarking on war, no man who is responsible can lead us again. The hollowness of these words soon became apparent, however, for as soon as war was declared the next day, Scott altered his tone and that of the Guardian, as if in imitation of the, quote, iron silence of the two radical ministers who had resigned. To an invitation to speak at a protest set up by the Manchester and Salford Trades and Labour Council on the 6th of August, Scott replied, quote, I am strongly of the opinion that the war ought not to have taken place and that we ought not to have become parties to it. But once in it, the whole future of our nation is at stake, and we have no choice but to do the utmost we can to secure success. From this position, it was not long until the Guardian had dropped its editorials against compulsion and conscription. Instead, it began to argue both might be necessary, so long as it was Lloyd George who led the effort to achieve victory in a, quote, nation marshaled and regimented for service. With the Guardian in the lead, the other radical liberal dailies and weeklies that had once stood firm against the Boer War now fell into line in a war to defeat the menace of, quote, Prussian militarism. Massingham at the Nation, Spender at the Westminster Gazette, along with other pro-Boers like Gilbert Murray and L.T. Hobhouse. L.T. Hobhouse, in fact, drew a line from his earlier stance as an opponent of the Boer War to his present position, citing Belgium. In a letter to his sister Emily, he wrote, quote, nearly all those who sympathized with the Boers as a small nation struggling for freedom now sympathize with the Belgians struggling for freedom. Against this backdrop of conformity among both radicals and socialists about the need to fight the war to a victorious finish, F.W. Hearst's stand at The Economist against the war once it had begun is striking. Under him, The Economist not only lamented a war that would draw, quote, millions of men from the factories to slay one another by order of the warlords of Europe as, quote, perhaps the greatest tragedy of human history, it also advocated an early negotiated peace as soon as the German advance on Paris had been halted at the Battle of the Marne. Thereafter, it decried the policies implemented by the last liberal government as so many betrayals of liberalism itself: censorship, tariffs, taxes, conscription, compulsion, martial law, and repression in Ireland. When the Liberal government fell in spring 1915, Hearst shed no tears for it. In fact, the letters he and Scott exchanged about the rise of the first coalition government in their capacity as friends, editors, and fellow liberals are deeply revealing, not just of their contrasting attitudes to the war, but of the ways it forced them to reassess the whole liberal project they had helped to forge since the 1880s. I'm wrapping up. Writing to Scott in May 1915, Hearst not only savaged the press, from the, quote, foul Northcliffe pogrom of people with German names to exclaiming, quote, what a poor thing is the Cadbury press. Hearst also seemed to reassess new liberalism and Lloyd George. What he had hoped from both in 1906 was a mix of Cobdenite peace and free trade abroad, with some social reform and military retrenchment at home. In what sounded like a retrospective verdict on what it had become instead of that, Hearst told Scott, quote, I am not sorry to see the organized hypocrisy of liberal imperialism based upon the unholy alliance of jingoism with socialism falling to pieces. Scott replied to Hearst in a cordial but apologetic note on 24 May. Rather than retracting or retracing his steps, Scott doubled down on the very elements of the wartime dispensation that made Hearst recoil. Quote, the war hardly bears thinking about, but I think I feel more strongly than you that the aggressive imperialism of Germany had to be resisted. Since, quote, it was likely to remain and to be a permanent menace to the liberal and pacific civilization of the Western powers, Scott saw the need for a more powerful state and a larger peacetime army in Britain. after the war, unless, quote, Germany ever did alter really and fundamentally, and social democracy, or better still, a revived liberalism, came by its own. But by then, Hearst and Scott were talking past each other. Hearst replied a few days later, bluntly rejecting Scott's predictions. Quote, the present outcry for compulsion is clearly manufactured, the object being to discipline and enslave the working class and to keep down Ireland. What right has the state to enslave men and ship them to unknown destinations to be slaughtered? I could not determine if Scott replied to Hearst's letter, but in a sense he already had, for on the same day he wrote a note to Lloyd George, imploring him not to leave the Ministry of Munitions for the Exchequer in the new coalition government, but to do both. Quote, you are obviously and preeminently cut out for this new and essential work. It was not to be the last of such letters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander, and thanks to all the speakers for bringing us such a important historical perspective. So we have about 18 minutes for discussion. Are there any questions that people would like to ask to our panelists directly? I need to remind everyone we are recording this, so if you ask your question live, it will be recorded. We do have a comment really from earlier, which I think is for Richard. I don't know if Priya is still in the call in the meeting, because she could ask it. I'm not sure if she's still here, but the point was about Richard's first paper. And so I'm quoting the comment now. Interesting, though, that those speaking for Ethiopia are Fabian socialists, not anti-colonial and white. James and others had to find other sources to write about Ethiopia, found their own newspaper because they weren't given the space in The Guardian, where James is cricket correspondent a few years later. London is a huge centre for Pan-Africanism, organising by Black campaigners. So maybe, Richard, you want to respond to that? I hope I was able to. I hope you were able to hear me.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to review the go back to the original comment to.
Okay.
So, I mean, is the question, why did I not focus on the Pan-Africanists in London, or why did the Guardian?
Well, one moment, because Priya is with us, and Priya,
Oh, sorry, yeah.
You can just if you want, you could speak if you wanted to say something. You don't have to.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
No, it's just a comment, and in a way, I think it's about the Guardian. It's not about your paper, Richard. In a sense, the Fabian socialists and liberals get to produce a critique of empire, but in the 30s and 40s, it is interesting that there is a quantum of people in London, Black people.
Well, a huge number of people.
Yeah, they are, but they're kind of reduced to writing in alternative or smaller sites like the New Leader or International African Opinion, which is founded in the light of the invasion of Ethiopia. It's a comment really about whose voice gets to be critical of empire when there's all this other stuff going on as well.
Yeah, I mean that's a really important point, because obviously by this stage, London, in a sense, is the epicenter of anti-colonial activism. London is the place where anti-colonial activists from all over the British Empire and beyond, in a sense, congregate, and as you say, are in essence forced into producing their own publications because they're denied their mouthpiece in more mainstream media, such as The Guardian. I mean, it's interesting, in my own survey of The Guardian during this period, as I mentioned, there's around 200 or so articles about Ethiopia and the Italian invasion. The vast majority are about international diplomacy and the pros and cons of negotiation, how the invasion might affect the whole notion of collective security and so forth. And obviously during this period there's the huge peace ballot, in which around half of the British voting population are consulted on their opinion about the future of the League of Nations and sanctions and disarmament and so forth, which is a massive undertaking in itself. But the voices of the actual people at the forefront of anti-colonialism in the imperial context themselves are by and large not given a voice. I came across one or two mentions of C.L.R. James, for example, a report of his of a speech he gave at Trafalgar Square, and I think that the report is a brief one, and it's disparaging of the fact that it talks in terms of the usual African orators at Trafalgar Square, and the fact that C.L.R. James was barely audible amongst the hubbub of traffic and passers-by. But aside from that, there's the odd reference to, for example, a motion carried by black sailors living in Cardiff about the Ethiopia crisis, or the fact that trade unionists in what was then British Guyana passed a resolution demanding that people be allowed to volunteer and fight for Ethiopia. By and large, as you quite rightly suggest, the kind of forefront of the discussion is really being carried by, a collection of, what we might call Fabian socialists, white intellectuals who, I guess you only have to look at their images and the photographs of the time to realise, they were coming from very privileged backgrounds. It's an interesting conundrum.
Richard, I'm just not worried. I'm thinking that we have quite a few questions now, so I'd like to try and go through them all. Unless Alexander or Kathy would like to add anything to this, to that point. Okay, so there is a question from Giora. Giora, would you like to ask it, or would you rather I read it out? It's a question to Alexander. Okay, Giora is joining us. Please, floor is yours. You're muted.
No, now I can. Excellent. Well, I thought you would read it out. It would be faster, but a question to Alexander. Was it easier for The Economist to express anti-war opinions because it was a weekly? And of course, I'm putting easier in comparison. Would a daily suffer more heavily with its sales taking something which is not a popular stance? And another following question from that is, did it hold similar criticism to The Guardian, or even more, during the Irish War of Independence after the war? And I mean, Kathy could take that also if there's a comparison there.
Okay, thank you. There are two more questions, or two other participants would like to ask questions. So, Nico, are you able to? No, you're not able to unmute yourself. Okay.
Yeah, I am now. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Great.
So this is primarily to Alexander, but also to Richard, because he talked about Pan-Africanism and the African continent. In his talk earlier on, Alan Rusbridger showed a quote at the start of his lecture about Cecil Rhodes and the Guardian's attitude towards him, and quoted a 1902 editorial saying Rhodes had done more than any Englishman to lower the reputation and to impair the strength and to compromise the future of the empire. So clearly fairly hostile to Rhodes. And I was interested in how the Guardian and Scott understood imperialism, which I believe Rhodes represented, and the export of people and capital to, in this case, Africa, as opposed to colonialism, which, direct rule and control, and whether you think it did understand the difference between them, and why it was more favourable to empire, as Catherine's talked about in Ireland, than it was towards imperialism.
Thank you, Nico. And before you answer, I'd like to ask Michael Hall, or I'm happy to read out the question. There is a question for Kathy, and then I'll invite everybody to respond. And if we have time, then we'll take another round. Maybe it's easier if I read it out. So this is a question to Kathy. When, if at all, did The Guardian publish anything direct from Sinn Féin? Sorry. So maybe Alexander, would you like to start? And then we'll ask everyone to contribute.
Yeah, thanks for those excellent questions. Okay, so as to Yora's question about the weekly versus the daily, and also about the Irish War of Independence, that I'm sure Kathy has even more to add to, I would say that, yeah, that's an interesting point, that that the differences between the periods at which they're published and the positions that they can take, but really I don't think it is about that, because for example, during the Boer War itself, Scott took the unpopular position of attacking the war, and I think one of the points of my paper is to draw a line between the kind of pro-Boer moment in which so many of these radicals actually earn their stripes and their sense that social reform, that some kind of combination of social reform along with a more traditional emphasis on free trade abroad is the kind of compound that's necessary to bring the Liberals back to power. So I think it really is a question of principle, and actually that Scott truly believes that once the war has begun, it's he as a nationalist, to a certain extent has to take that line, and I think that Hearst, in part because of a kind of libertarian streak within his version of new liberalism, actually kind of is rebarbative and can kind of do this more critical position. Also, in part because he at first thinks that there's a basis of support for that position within finance capital in the City of London. And as the war progresses by 1916, it's quite clear that that argument is either lost by finance capital in favor of some other version of capital, or it's that actually there's this sense by then that business as usual, in both the literal and figurative sense in which that phrase is used to describe the conduct of the war under Asquith, has to come to an end. As for the Irish War of Independence, once Hearst is, it is an unpopular thing to do. Hearst is fired for it in 1916. The Board of Trustees remove him for his negative kind of anti-war position. He's replaced by a guy named Hartley Withers, and Withers sort of gives minimal coverage to the War of Independence. There's a kind of brushing it under the rug. The Guardian, it sounds like, as Catherine was saying, it's much more prominent. Although interestingly, also within still this frame, quite consistently from, Scott. Interesting. I was thinking during Catherine's paper in the 1880s, he's around for the original Home Rule schism, and so he has these positions worked out already then. He has Home Rule within Home Rule. He has a version of liberal constitutionalism and liberal unity then too. So I'd be interested to hear what she has to say about that. And as to Nico's question, sorry, very quickly about roads, that's a fascinating question actually, and I've a lot that I could say about it. But one of the contradictions within the radical position within the Liberal Party is, and I think one of the explanations for how we get from kind of the opposition to the Boer War to the kind of on board with, there is a sort of excessive emphasis on figures like Cecil Rhodes and other individuals who are sort of nefarious capitalists, and rather than a systemic analysis of the forces driving Britain towards imperial aggrandizement during that period, it's sort of the Lenin takes Hobson's analysis and pushes it further, you could say. But the thing also about their discourse, you'll notice, is that they always attack aggressive imperialism. So Cecil Rhodes, to people like Scott and Hearst, is an aggressive imperialist who undermines the unity of the empire. And so there's a sense that the free trade empire, right, which is itself not quite what they think it is or ever was, but they have this idea that the free trade empire is a force for a pacific force, and that if it were maintained, a version of some status quo empire were maintained, that there would be peace and commercial prosperity around the world. And so this is very tricky by the time you get to 1914, even the last third of the 19th century, because imperial rivalries are increasing as Germany seeks a larger share of the spoils as the most, rapidly advancing industrial country in the world. So that's just a brief response to that.
Thank you. Kathy?
Yeah, I don't have all that much else to add, really, other than one of the differences between the sort of reactions to the Guardian's coverage of the Boer War in comparison to the Irish War of Independence is that a lot more people are on side. People really support Scott's view of the Irish War of Independence and his ideas around mediation, conciliation, which are very much driven by his, by the Guardian's liberal tradition. Scott believed his editorial line. Ireland was such a prominent topic during the Irish War of Independence. In fact, and not just in Scott's editorials. And like I've said, Ireland was the most editorialized topic by Scott throughout his entire editorship. The only two other issues coming closer, women's suffrage and the reform of the House of Lords. Scott's personal contributions to the editorial columns are overwhelmingly about Ireland. And like I say, people supported his views on that, whereas in the Boer War case, not everybody did, hence why they had such a drop in readership during that period. But yeah, just to build on what Alex said about not necessarily being against imperialism, I said in my paper, he promoted Dominion states, he promoted Ireland remaining within the British Empire. And it's this aggressiveness, this violence that Scott is really against. And I explained some of the reasons for that, I believe, in the paper. Scott fundamentally believes the British Empire is a place for peace and justice and liberty. And this really comes out of his responses to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. He's trying to promote the ratification of the treaty. It still has to go through Parliament, both parliaments, Dáil Éireann and the British Parliament at Westminster. And all over this time, he's talking about, the Irish have this opportunity to be part of the peaceful British Empire that's built on justice and liberty, and that's really promoted because essentially he wants this treaty to pass and he wants the Irish question solved. So that really underpins a lot of his discourse after the Irish War of Independence, actually. That's all I really have to add to that.
Thank you, Kathy. We have one final question. I'm aware we're probably out of time, but I'll because it's for.
Sorry, Mirca. I just can I just respond to Michael Hall's question as well?
Okay.
Before we close. Yeah. So this is something that I found really interesting about Scott's coverage of editorial content on the Irish War of Independence, is that he's really critical of the British government's propaganda policies. But he uses Sinn Féin's own publication, or Dáil Éireann's own publication, the Irish Bulletin, as a basis of some of his editorials. So he uses this Republican Party outrightly propaganda publication, the Irish Bulletin, as the basis of some of his editorials. So that's interesting there, that he's engaging with the Republican stance and he's actually using it for information. He takes reports from the Irish Bulletin on Irish violence as closer to the truth than what the government's selling at that time. And he uses these as the basis of his editorials, but he fundamentally doesn't believe in an Irish Republic. So that's interesting there. So yes, he does publish things built on information provided by Sinn Féin, which is in the Irish Bulletin.
Yeah, and sorry, Kathy, I didn't realize you hadn't addressed that point. Sorry. So we are out of time, but maybe I'll give speakers 1 minute each, and we'll be really strict on that, to answer this final question, which is, were there any anti-war voices allowed during the conflicts you described? Was there any evidence of polyphony on issues of empire? It will really have to be 1 minute each maximum. So Richard.
I think to a degree, there's a sense of differing voices, and obviously in my presentation I didn't really have a chance to talk about the letters page, and I think this is where you see a multitude of different approaches. I think that's a really important and underused resource. I think all of us, to some extent, have focused on key individuals, and I think focusing on the correspondence pages is a very fruitful way of exploring the multitude of voices that is possible within the limits of a liberal newspaper.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just off the back of what Richard just said there about correspondence columns, you do see a number of Republican voices voiced in the correspondence columns, calling for the end of the war and basically just let us get on with it, get out kind of situation. What's interesting about the publication of these letters is that they're always followed up by a direct response by C.P. Scott. So anytime there's this sort of challenge to the more moderate approach, Scott engages with them directly and uses them to reassert his own editorial line, which is that we should take a moderate approach to the Irish question and establish a dominion. So even though some of these voices that are disagree with Scott are published in the correspondence columns, it's always used then as a stepping stone to reassert the Guardian's editorial line.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Alexander, final words.
So I can't speak to the entirety of the First World War at the Guardian. I haven't looked at all of the issues, but I will say that the Defense of the Realm Act and the Official Secrets Act do limit, in the case of the First World War, in a way that isn't true, I think, of either of the cases that Richard and Catherine have been speaking about, of what papers can publish. And so there is really, truly a very limited scope for dissent over this issue, and also an attempt, I think, to mask the imperial origins of the conflict and some of the striking, letters that I found between, or the diary entries that Scott has about his meetings with Asquith and with Lloyd George. There's a map on the wall, and they're sort of pointing at things that they want to take from Germany, and also about the idea of imperial contrast there between the realities of the conflict and what British readers could see.
Thank you, Alexander. And I think that brings us to the end of the panel. I'm sure we could go on for a while, but we have two other exciting panels starting in 7 minutes. So I hope some of you will join us for those. Thanks to the speakers, and thanks to everyone for joining us on this sunny afternoon. It's really great to have such a fantastic audience. Thank you so much.